That's right. He seems very happy.
I am
Okay, good evening and welcome to Sacred Heart University. My name is Dan Rober. I am Associate Professor and Chair of the Catholic Studies Department here. And on behalf of the Center for Catholic Studies and the Human Journey Colloquia Series, I welcome you to our presentation of The Jesuit Disruptor by Michael Higgins, the subtitle Personal Portrait of Pope Francis. So we have with us the author of the book, Michael Higgins, who is at the University of Toronto and is Distinguished Professor of Catholic Thought Emeritus here at Sacred Heart University. We also have Mary Kate Holman, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Fairfield University. And we have David Gibson, who is the Director of the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University in New York City. So I will be your moderator as well as a panelist this evening. And I'm going to get us started by asking Dr. Higgins to introduce us to his book. Tell us a little bit about your odyssey with Pope Francis.
Thank you, Dan. Is that clear? Could you hear me, everyone? Good. The Jesuit Disruptor originated as a response to a request from my editor of House of Venanzi Press in Toronto. This is a quite prestigious literary and fiction publishing house. It doesn't publish books like this, but they were enormously interested in the fact that Pope Francis has a very high popularity acceptance record. People from outside the Catholic Church admire him enormously. So that kind of global phenomenon where Pope Francis is seen as a leader in a time in which leaders seem to be very few, and a figure of international consequence who's taken on issues that are not narrowly Catholic in their focus, for instance, the environment, immigration, several other related issues. So Francis is probably the most popular leader in religion or in politics anywhere. So they wanted a book about him that would explain him. And I said, although I've written biographies before, Thomas Merton and Jean Vanier, and Henry Nouwen, and Emmett Carter, I didn't want to write a biography. I wanted to write a portrait. And so the book is the portrait of a pontificate. There is some early information, biographical, in it, but there have been several biographies already written about Pope Francis, and some of them very good. Not all of them, but some of them very good, especially Austin Ivory's. So the biographical work has already been done. I wanted to concentrate specifically on the pontificate itself. So that's why it's called a personal portrait of Pope Francis. Originally, it was supposed to be a personal portrait of a pontificate, but they felt that a non-Catholic audience might not know what pontificate meant. And so they said, well, just put Pope Francis there instead. So that's how the book came to be. About 2 years from the moment of commission to Genesis to execution. Not too long a period, but I'm technically a retired university president, so I had a little more time than I would probably have otherwise. Great deal of research and meeting with people who know Pope Francis. I chose at no time to meet the Pope. I think that when you're writing a study that has a biographical theme, at least, running through it, you should keep your distance from your subject, because it's easy to develop an affectionate bond for the figure you're writing about. And Francis has that remarkable capacity to touch people, to touch their heart. And I thought, if the book is to enjoy any kind of scholarly objectivity, I need to keep my distance. He's aware of the book. Cardinal Czerny gave him his private copy of the book, but we've never been in correspondence, and that seems fine to me. What is important, and the reviews I think have largely attested to this, is that the book is a critical study of the pontificate, but an affectionate one at the same time. I am pro-Francis, okay? I'm in favor of this pontificate. I think it's the most extraordinary papacy since Giuseppe Roncalli or John 23rd from 1958 to 1963. It's that significant in my view. So I am pro-Francis, but I also entertain the right as a scholar to view this pontificate in terms of its entirety by judging both favorably and then when the case warrants it, judging unfavorably. So one reviewer said Higgins is no apologist. And that is an important thing to say because in a polarizing environment, we often find people who are either adversarial or apologetical. And apologetical in this case means that they are on the defense. They defend their subject and they promote their subject. And they're not tolerant of dissenting opinion. An adversarial argument, of course, proceeds on the basis of this is a personality to disestablish, to take apart, okay? You want to avoid either extreme. You want to maintain a level of objective neutrality. But if you're doing any kind of biographical work, and the book is partly biographical, but though not principally so, you must have some affection for your subject. You must. Because it seems to me you're going to spend time with this person. And even if you don't do it directly, I have written a biography of a living subject in which I met with him and we had Manhattans together and we did all kinds of things. And it was very difficult to write the book because you're too close to the subject. So I thought this time, not making that mistake. Subsequent biographies I wrote were of dead people. That's always an advantage. If they're dead, they can't argue with them. But if they're alive, it's complicated. So I kept my distance. So this is just a few ruminations just at the beginning, Jen, just to set the context of where this came from. I'll end by making this comment. It's called the Jesuit Disruptor. I got not a scorching letter, but a letter in good faith from a friend who was the president of the Association of Catholic Universities and Colleges in Washington. Dr. Tiller would know him, Dr. Richard Yanakowski, marvelous guy. And he wrote and he said, you know, Michael, I read everything you write and I love what you write, but I hate this title. I just hate the title. Can you change the title? Because people will think that he's just a subversive, that he's a disruptor in the way that Zuckerberg or Altman or whatever are disruptors, technological Silicon Valley disruptor. And I said, no, because the spelling is O-R. Disruptor with O-R is more benign. It means somebody who changes tack, introduces new things, but not with the radical, let's make a mess and start over. That's disruptor E-R. So there's two spellings at homonym. There's two spellings of the term to disrupt. And I chose the former one. So I think it defines Francis. So I stand by the title. Anyway, preliminary comments over.
Thank you. So Mary Kate, you've written about ecclesiology, about tradition, and about women's issues in the church. All of these are things that have come up as issues within the pontificate of Francis, and all of them are things that Higgins covers. So I'd like you to take your pick and jump in on either combination of Francis and Higgins on the way they're engaging these issues.
Okay, thanks, Dan. That's a great question. I'll just start by opening and saying I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss this book this week in particular. I was saying to David on the walk over here that obviously this event has been on the books for months and we did not know Francis would be hospitalized and in critical condition. And yeah, it feels timely. I pray that he's all right and that this is just a scare. But regardless, it sort of has thrown his pontificate as a whole into perspective for me. And reading this book while thinking about him in the hospital and preparing my remarks made me realize the affection that I also have for the Pope, because I Pope Francis was elected when I had just started graduate school in theology, and on this question of tradition, on this question of ecclesiology, I think that I came into the world of Catholic theology as a female scholar being told by people outside, why would you do that? Like, you're a woman, you're like, why would you choose this patriarchal institution to dedicate your life to studying? And I noticed a shift, even in that first year of graduate school, that there seemed to be a shift in the culture of my graduate school as people, as theologians, felt a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more able to speak what they thought. And we've seen since, right, that Francis has really shifted in the Vatican's position towards theologians. What is now called the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, but was the CDF before that, and was the Holy Office before that, and was the Office of the Inquisition before that, up through the mid-2000s was really going after theologians, especially those who were priests or nuns, who were making claims that were sort of creatively engaging the Catholic tradition with the realities of the outside world, and being scrutinized and being censored or self-censored in some cases. And so I've been reflecting on how Francis's time sort of mapped onto my own experience as a theologian, and realizing I think the culture that we are in now as a church, where we are more able to speak freely and to critically and creatively engage the tradition, is a tone that he's really set. And I think you capture that well. I really appreciate, Michael, how in your conclusion you talk about the document Ad Theologiam Promovendam that Francis released probably right in the weeks of you finishing this book, I assume. Right? Yeah, it's pretty recent. Sort of reflecting a theological method that is more inductive, less deductive, more open to the realities of the world. So that's sort of on the theology side of the equation. As the token woman on this panel, I'm happy to field the woman's question as well. Again, I think that now that my perspective has shifted and I'm sort of considering Francis's years as a whole, instead of sort of reacting to in real time when he says something helpful about women or when he says something problematic about women, right? I think that zooming out a little bit, I see Francis's pontificate as very positive in its in the ways that he has made space for women to continue doing the work that we have always already been doing in the church, and making space for conversations around women's leadership and women's ministry that were effectively shut down or silenced by previous papacies. I am curious. I think you do a really beautiful job in this book, Michael, of acknowledging where Francis makes great strides and where he's still kind of a man of his time, or where he isn't totally what's the word I'm looking for? He isn't totally exempt from the clerical and masculine culture that he often does still critique, and I think you really fairly represent that here. But you also know, you note how much progress has been able to be made, even around the conversation, in particular around the potential for women to be ordained to the diaconate, a conversation that's live right now in a way that it really had not been for a while. So a question that I had for Michael, I know this happened after the book that, was published. Francis has sort of sent mixed signals around those issues, but has, in the Synod on Synodality and in so many ways, created the space for the conversation to even happen. That comment he made in his 60 Minutes interview was that about a year ago, 6 months ago, when Nora O'Donnell asked him, will women be ordained as deacons? And he just said, no. That shocked a lot of people, because it seemed to sort of contradict all of the groundwork he was laying, or at least procedurally, so that people could have these conversations. So I would ask, maybe to kick it back to I don't want to step on your toes as moderator, Dan, but in some of the inconsistencies that you see in Francis, and I think that 60 Minutes interview is a sort of snapshot of it in particular. What you make of that, Michael?
I remember the interview, and you're quite right. Francis, in my view, is caught in a interesting position culturally. I think he's partial to the ordination of women to sacramental ministry, but he will not undertake this task until he achieves what he considers to be some form of ecclesial consensus. This is the reason why, for instance, he shied away from responding to the request from the Latin American bishops at the time of the Amazonia Synod, when they asked for the ordination of viri probati. These are mature married men that would be brought forward and ordained into priestly ministry to serve the vast area of Amazonia, which includes several countries outside of Brazil. People were stunned that Francis did not act on that recommendation. The recommendation enjoyed a considerable degree of unanimity among the synod delegates that were present, but he didn't act on it. My sense is not that he didn't feel sympathetic toward the request. He does, because he's in many ways a practical theologian. He prefers reality to ideas. He talks about this in several places. But my sense is that he was going to move without the appropriate consensus of the church. And because of that, he is reminded, and he's always conscious of this, that his role as the Bishop of Rome, remember, he defines himself often as the Bishop of Rome, not as the Supreme Pontiff, not as the head of the Vatican City State, not as the servants of God, all the other titles he has, but he defines himself as the Bishop of Rome. The Petrine Ministry's primary charism or gift is to hold the church in unity. This is what he fears. Every pope fears this, presiding over the fracturing of the church. So Francis pushes as far as he can go, okay, creates an environment of engaged and respectful culture, and then he moves slightly back. And he does this not because he's cowardly, but because the time isn't propitious. It's not the right time. Now, while I was in Rome the last time, the issue of the ordination of women to the diaconate surfaced again, and quite rightly. It surfaced, and David will confirm this, at almost every press conference we had for 40 days. Every day, the Pope, they would say, well, we're not really discussing this issue, and it would surface. It would come up among theologians, press people, whatever. So it never went away. And it didn't disappear from the papal agenda because the final report of the synod says on the issue of the ordination of women to diaconal ministry, at least, it is an open question, a question for future discernment, meaning the issue isn't dead. This outraged a number of conservative Catholics who felt, well, the issue is dead. Why are you accepting this? Especially since the Pope, at the end of the synod, accepted the final report, incorporated it, and said that this was now the teaching magisterium of the church. Very interesting, because in the past, when a synod was finished, the synod fathers, mostly because they were mostly clerics, would submit a report, a synthesis report, which the Pope would receive, and then, several months later, maybe 6 months, a year, it depends, would write the official position. Not this time. Francis did something that had never been done before. He accepted the report, says, this is the teaching of the church. I accept it. Well, that line there in which he talks about this question is not settled, that is open for discernment, means that Francis has not foreclosed discussion or development. There have been 3 commissions set to establish the role of women in the diaconate. One that a report that came out for the International Theological Commission, and then 2 other commissions that Francis hasn't acted on, nor has he released the results. Many of the synod fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers who were there, because it was a real Catholic gathering of ordained and lay and women and men, they were all there, and he said, well, he's not foreclosing this, he's not ending this. He's keeping the issue alive. And many people spoke about what diaconal ministry means to them. And I have to say, there were a couple of occasions when I was quite struck by the compelling arguments for the ordination of women to the priesthood, which weren't driven by a rights argument or weren't driven by some kind of ideological slant, but were driven by a deep commitment to enhancing pastoral presence in the life of the church through the gifts of women. Now, you got to be careful about this because Francis often talks about feminine genius. Nobody knows what he means. And very often it's the kind of phrase that Roman prelates like because it helps to differentiate people from that. But we never talk about the masculine genius. We just talk about the feminine genius, and then nobody really defines it. So it gets problematic. So Francis is just not at that point where he feels, okay, let's move on this right now. And I'll end this by this comment. One of the people I lived with during the time I was in Rome is an archbishop from Namibia, okay, in Africa. And we got along wonderfully well. We love to laugh. We're the same shape, we're kind of rotund. He's black, I'm white, we're the same height. I mean, we just, people love this. We were like a comedy act. So there was the two of us doing this all the time. And one time he came back and he said, oh, I just had a meeting with the Pope. And I said, what was it about? He says, well, it's about polygamy. I said, about polygamy? Well, you know, having several wives, right? And I said, he says, a big issue in Africa. And we had to meet with the Pope, and the Pope put the question back to us. He said, you live in a polygamous culture, and polygamy doesn't fit really well with the traditional understanding of Christian marriage. You need to work on this, but accompany the people. Don't judge the people, accompany them. Be with them. So I said, so polygamy is everywhere in Africa. He said, indeed. He said, the Pope wasn't started, he was empowering us. I said, well, what about polyandry? Meaning several husbands, right? And he said, well, there's only one country where that's a problem. And he wouldn't tell me what country it was, but I think it's Namibia. So I thought afterwards, this is again a wonderful example of the universal church. For many North Americans and Europeans, the move to empower women in ministry is paramount. It's not a marginal issue. It's not a footnote. It's an important constitutive dimension of Christian life. For many Africans, this isn't an issue at all. What is an issue is how we're going to deal with the pastoral reality that we have several wives and children from different generations, and then how do we work this within the context of Christian marriage? This doesn't mean, however, that it is, and this is sometimes used by various obscurantists or conservatives to say, well, these are issues only for enlightened, wokish North American women. It's not true. Some of the most compelling arguments that were made in Rome on the role of women in ministry were made by African women theologians. So it's a very dangerous thing to culturally say, well, this is what's happening in Latin America, this is what's happening in Southeast Asia. But there are, nonetheless, having said that, there are different pastoral priorities depending on your jurisdiction. Some of the most deeply moving things, and Francis was there, as Dave can attest to, Francis is there for pretty well, not all, but most of the sessions, is the anguish, the palpable anguish and pain of representatives from Lebanon and from Jordan and from Israel, and most especially from Gaza and the Sudan and Darfur and whatnot, talking about the deep pain of watching their people bleed out in their countries, okay? And so that pain, you can see tears in their eyes, like the hopelessness of this. So, you know, if you're trying to avoid being killed by the Janjaweed, who are running around shooting people as militia. That's a little different than a debate that goes on in the academy in downtown New York or in downtown Toronto. Very different reality. The Pope is presiding over this large universal gathering. And so without diminishing any of this, each issue has to be prioritized in the context of a country's particular priorities. And some of those priorities are just simply life and death. I will say this, I mean, this is a very long-winded response to Mary Kate's comment, but one of the things where Francis does move is on the appointment of women to senior positions in the governance structure of the church. Currently, within the last month, before he got ill, he appointed a woman the head of the governorate, the governorato. And the governorato is the body that actually governs the Vatican city-state. It's one of the most important positions in Vatican governance. It's a woman. In addition, he appointed a woman head of a dicastery or a department with direct responsibility for people in apostolic life and secular institutes. Two key positions now held by women, which would have been inconceivable in any other papacy, inconceivable. In addition to a number of women holding positions as the Dean of the School of Social Sciences, right through the whole Vatican structure, these remarkably well-educated women who are in a position where they are making decisions now that are affecting the men. So on sacramental ministry, much improvement, minimal. On incorporating the women in positions of the highest leadership of the church, it's happening, and it's happening on the ground, and it's happening now. And it's because of Francis.
All right. David, so your background and training, in addition to your great work at Fordham directing the Center on Religion and Culture, is as a journalist, and with which you're very much still engaged. And Francis, in addition to the rich theological discourse that he's generated, has also been a pope who's generated a lot of discourse, with a capital D perhaps, in the journalistic and social media and other worlds, not least through his being willing to talk to journalists in a perhaps more frank way, not to be ironic on his name, than some popes in the past. So I was wondering how you would fit Michael Higgins' book into the discourse about Francis, both as it's existed and as it's kind of rapidly been evolving during this period of his illness over the past couple of weeks. And I plead guilty as a contributor to said discourse in terms of people quickly trying to kind of sum up or think more broadly about what he's been up to.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Michael, for being here. Wonderful book. Congratulations. At some point in this book, I think you say this isn't meant as a comprehensive biography or overview, but it's a great read. And it is a great overview, especially whatever happens in the hospital, in Gemelli Hospital. We're approaching the end of this pontificate, and this is a great one-volume summary. And the personal aspect that you bring to it, I think, makes it that much more valuable. Guilty as charged, but so many of us who write books or write about the Catholic Church try to do it in this kind of, purely analytical, this is the way it is, rather than being honest and saying, this is really what I think. This is how he strikes me, and I think that's an important part to bring to it. Dan, what you said about in terms of his being a disruptor in communications and media, you can't stress, there are two aspects I want to point on this. You can't stress how disruptive he's been and appealing. It's part of his appeal, and part of the controversy is he speaks like a normal person. And he just talks to you, and he uses non-papal language. I contributed to one volume, what's it called? I can't remember, the Pope's lexicon or something like that, about all the words he uses and all the phrases he uses. Some of them which I can't even repeat here because they're sort of semi-dirty. But and bad. And he says dumb things about women. It was like, what are you saying? But he speaks like an actual human being, an actual pastor, a flawed human being. But he says what he thinks. He tells the story on the way to the Philippines of the woman who came up to him with 7 children. She said, Father, the doctors say if I get pregnant again, I might die. And he said, woman, don't tempt God. We're not rabbits. He said this. This is like what Monty Python would say about, Catholics. And he said, women, we're not rabbits. Be sensible. Use birth control if you have to, that kind of thing. So that kind of thing. But it also drives people crazy. He's his own communications, Vatican communications shop. He doesn't have interpreters. And that is very disruptive. It's very attractive. If you're a journalist, you love it. I'm a journalist. I'm career journalist. I'm now honest work for the first time. I'm at higher education. But I was at Conclave in 2005. I was at Conclave in March 2013. And just a quick story. And I remember being there. One of the first meetings that a pope has is with the media. John Paul II. I think maybe John the 23rd did it, but John Paul II really started it in 1978. John Paul II said, we need, the church has to be like a house of glass, transparent for all to see. Anyway, so fast forward. 2005, I remember Pope Benedict XVI, I was assigned to write a biography of whoever succeeded John Paul II, and out walks Cardinal Ratzinger. I thought, oh. But it was fun to kind of do. Benedict walks out in the Paul VI audience hall with his little red shoes and his white cassock, and to meet the media. There are like 2,000 reporters covering the thing, and he has a paper to read. It's one paragraph, greeting the media, giving his blessing in Italian, German, English, and French. What's missing? Spanish, which most of the world's Catholics speak. Didn't have that. So he reads a paragraph in each language, gives his blessing, and walks off. Okay, that's Ratzinger. Fast forward 8 years, Bergoglio is elected. He comes on, he sits there, he looks out, he said, how you doing? He starts reading something, and he says, he puts aside, perhaps you want to know how come I called myself Francis. And you could absolutely hear the entire press corps think, oh my God, this is so wonderful. And he tells a story about Claudio Homus in the conclave in the Sistine Chapel hugging him and said, don't forget the poor. Don't forget the poor in the conclave, just after he's been elected. And Francis said, it was at that moment I said, I'll take the name Francis. And it was this beautiful, but the point is, it was an incredibly human story. It was just, he was just speaking. He had this prepared text. He said, the heck with that, I'll just put it down. And he just spoke to us. The other great thing, and I won't go on too long, is that he also at the end, so you're a journalist, you're trying to find the lead to the story. That's the lead. He said, some people think I named myself after Francis Xavier or something after Francis. He said, let me tell you why. So, it's after Francis of Assisi. Creation, environment, signaled all the things that would become central. But at the very end, this is amazing. He's there. He said, now, he stands up, he said, now it's time for me to give my apostolic blessing. But I know that some of you are not Catholic and some of you are not believers. It was the media, so he obviously knew his audience. Some of you are not believers. I don't want to offend your conscience. So I will not make the sign of the cross in front of you, but know that you have my blessing in my heart. It's so moving. And he walked off. No pope would ever, ever, ever do that. And the fact that his first thing was to think about his audience. Would this offend you? Maybe you don't believe. Maybe you're Jewish. Maybe whatever you are. Know that you have my blessing, but it's from my heart. So that's that kind of, Dan, to get to your point, is critical. The other thing I'll just say real quickly, I know Mary Kate is better on this. The reason we're having this discussion and the reason we can talk about women and the reason we can talk about all of these things and we're not being burned on a pyre out here or having your license to teach theology lifted is because of Francis has allowed the open discourse. That is key. Again, the point is you can disagree with Francis. Before, dissent was banned. Now you can disagree. We can talk about these things. He may disagree for now about women, for example, but he lets the discourse go on, the disagreement go on. This is foundational, I think.
Thank you. So rather than ask myself a question as the moderator.
Can I ask one?
What?
I'll ask.
Oh, you have a question, Dave? Okay. So what I want to do, so this book is written and published by a Canadian publishing house and by a Canadian author. I will note, however, that it does also list the US dollars as a denomination of currency on the book, and it is for sale in this room. By the way, for those who are here, you can purchase it right here in this room for $21.99 US dollars. Pope Francis has had an interesting relationship to the United States, one might say. And this doesn't come up a huge amount in the book. I was looking in the index for the United States, and the main thing that came out was the US as not so much the epicenter of the sexual abuse crisis in the church, but certainly the place where it first came to light in a sustained way. Right, because of the Boston Globe and other earlier investigative journalism by the National Catholic Reporter and other places that started to expose this problem, which, as we know, is a worldwide phenomenon. And most recently, right before he went into the hospital, Pope Francis engaged very directly in questions of import to US politics by directly critiquing positions associated with the Catholic vice president of the United States. So, Michael, if you were to give an epilogue or a US introduction, perhaps, to this book, how would you treat, for an American audience, how you view Pope Francis and his relationship to the US? As somebody who is Canadian, but spent a substantial amount of time here in the US, here at Sacred Heart.
That's a good question, Dan. I actually do deal with Francis in the States in the context of Thomas Merton and his address to the joint houses of Congress.
Yes.
So it surfaces in particular cases like that. Also, several prominent American prelates, Tobin and Zubich and McElroy, all appear in the book, if even only in footnotes. So there is some of that. But you're correct. The thrust is not primarily U.S., nor is it Canadian. I think what I tried to do is to look at him through a largely global lens. Mm-hmm. And so if I were doing something uniquely specific to the United States, it does seem to me that this has been the center, and we know this to be the case, of the most vociferous, moneyed, and aggressive opposition to Francis anywhere in the world. And there have been several studies done by this. Christopher Lamb, who's currently the CNN correspondent, but hitherto before that, he was the Rome correspondent for the Tablet of London, wrote a book specifically about opposition to the Pope Francis emanating from the United States, either through Eternal World Television Network or through more subtle channels, particularly Bishop Robert Barron and whatnot, various pockets of resistance to Francis and Francis' theology. I did discover when I was in Rome that there are very strong concentrations of resistance to the Francis agenda that are identified with very specific media outlets or ecclesiastical celebrities that are American. In the house that I stayed in on the Via Aurelia with the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, an international missionary order, that's where I met my buddy, the Archbishop of Namibia. But when I was there, I ran into somebody who was a core of maybe 3 or 4 people who were very unlike everybody else in complexion, disposition, attitude, and everything else from everybody else in the house. So I asked them who they were, and they said they were Americans, and they were there working for Eternal Word Television Network, Mother Angelica's body, which is not noted for its pro-Francis sympathies. And I said, I'm surprised. And they said, well, we rent some space here in the villa, which is the home for the Oblates, which had been given to them by the Pacellis, which is the famous Italian family from which Pope Pius XII came from. So it's a lovely villa on a hill with trees and everything. And they have some rooms that they can rent. So the Oblates rented it to these people working with Eternal Word Television Network. And I said, well, how many of you are here in Rome, either covering the synod or otherwise? They said, oh, only about 500. Well, God, 500? You know, that's about 50 times more than any other press agency anywhere in Europe. So I said, 500? Well, we like to track the Holy Father's thinking. Well, I'm sure you do. Every possible egregious lapse that you consider Francis has made in terms of his responsibility as Peter. So I thought, well, this is really interesting. And then you discover in other pockets at the press conferences of people that work within a particular network. Now, David made the comment, and I think quite rightly, Francis has created a culture where people speak freely. He talks about this in theological terms as parousia, but it's creating a culture where people can talk in a way uninhibited, without fear of censure, sanction, or judgment. He believes strongly in this, and he's created a culture in which that's possible. So in one sense, you kind of balk at it. Oh my God, 500 of Mother Angelica's acolytes hanging out. What are we going to do about that? To, well, okay, well, let's see how it works in this Roman climate. And if there's going to be conversation, that conversation could be perhaps a conversation in the spirit. Francis's argument that deep reverencing for the other, deep listening, punctuated by silence, and the careful articulation of one's position creates a culture of acceptance. That's Francis's argument. That was the motivating modality or operating modality of the Synod. So yes, some of the sharpest criticism of Francis from the left in Rome came from very disgruntled priests of the Diocese of Rome. And they said to me, well, you know, the Pope's going on about synodal way of operating. Meanwhile, he's completely restructured the Diocese of Rome. Nobody ever talked to us about this. We had no idea. Now we have to think differently because our regions are all different. So I heard this from the Dean of the Faculty of Middle East Studies at one of the larger pontifical universities. And so I wanted to corroborate this. So I talked to somebody else who's very close to the scene. They said, oh yes, Francis did this because he got frustrated by the inaction, that he would request things to be done and he would encounter resistance. And eventually he loses patience. And one of the big things that he's concerned about, that he's constantly fighting with the Italian bishops about, is fiscal impropriety. There is corruption in the church in Italy. Francis wants to address it, and he encounters regular resistance. So every now and then he gets to the point and says, well, that's it, not taking it anymore. And he makes a decision that appears to be arbitrary, but actually comes at the end of a long struggle to make reform and change. So the role of the conservative faction within the Catholic Church is a very significant one. A large proportion of that resistance is US specific. Many bishops in the United States are fairly conservative. There are bishops who are more progressive, and Sacred Heart University has hosted them many times over the years, but they are a minority. I remember talking to Tom Rees. He's an American Jesuit, and he's a political scientist. And I was at the end of one meeting, and I said, what are we going to do to implement the Synod? He says, look, Michael, before I'm even a Jesuit, I'm a political scientist, and I can tell you one thing. Policy is personnel. If we don't have the right people on the ground, the policy ain't going anywhere. So this is the challenge Francis faces. How do you find people within the leadership structure, meaning the episcopate in this case, not the faculties of theology, not the thinkers, but the episcopate, the managers? How do you find the right people to put in place so that you can move the church forward in a progressive way that is also continuous with the past, respectful of the organic tradition, at the same time open to accommodation, a kind of Cardinal Newman approach to history and to the evolution of doctrine. That's the big challenge. And it is almost, in some respects, insurmountable. Because at the same time you need these personnel, they seem to be short in the pool. Cardinal Ouellet, who is the former head of the dicastery, or the body that creates bishops or makes bishops, now succeeded by an American, James Provost. Prevost rather, they can't find the clientele, the candidates. Cardinal Ouellet said, you know, there's about a third of the people we asked to be bishops say no. We've never encountered this before. Never encountered it before. So they go to certain bishops, candidates, they say, no, they want to do this. And so you go further down. And so you end up with a situation that you're not getting in some jurisdictions, not all, okay? In some cases, not in every case, you get poor leadership candidates. As a consequence, this affects the implementation of the conciliar vision and of the synodal vision. So it's the big challenge. And it's, again, come back to this, it's the larger episcopal entrenchment appears to be America.
Thank you. So now we have time to open it up to some questions from the audience. And those questions can be addressed to any of the panelists. So does anybody have a question, want to get us started? Yes, all right, let me bring the microphone.
Hello, Chuck.
Delightful panel, delightful discussion. I guess I'll address this to Michael. I have difficulty, I understand the incredible affection the world has for the Holy Father. But I guess a true disruptor in my books would be someone that would put women on the altar. And, you know, when I was an altar boy, women weren't even allowed beyond the railing. And so we've come a ways beyond that. But I find it hard to swallow that we should be grateful because he's allowing us to talk about the issue. And I think there's going to be 138 cardinals, I believe, that appoint his successor. And to David's point, it's going to be sooner than later when that comes. And I'm sure that politicking has already started between the liberals and the conservatives to figure out who's going to be next. But a true disruptor in my mind would be someone that would blow the place up, if you will, and make the decision. We're not committing science here. This is not overly difficult in my mind. And I'm also amazed that globally women have put up with this, frankly. It's a far different world today. Women are educated and they're earning and they're outpacing men and they're into the corporate boardrooms and on and on and on. And why put up with this? And anyway, you get my drift. I understand his greatness. I understand his appeal, but I was expecting more. Does that make sense?
It does. No, it does make sense. We have expectations around Francis that haven't entirely been achieved. I know my own personal frustration over what I thought would have been a wonderful moment that Francis could have taken that would have moved us in closer to the direction you're talking about, Chuck. And that was near the end of the synod. Near the end of the last synod, we have what is called a consistory. That is when the Pope names the new cardinals that he's created. Interesting use of language. Popes don't ennoble, elevate, or anoint. They create cardinals. So he created these new cardinals, and one of them was Timothy Ratcliffe. Timothy Ratcliffe is a Dominican from Oxford University, a very eminent spiritual writer and thinker, who was one of the spiritual guides of the synod. There were two, Mother Angelini, an Italian abbess, and one a Dominican friar. He created the Dominican friar cardinal. And I thought, what an extraordinary lack of imagination not to have created the nun a cardinal as well. Remember, cardinals, that's not an order. It's not a priestly order. The cardinals are it's an honor. It's a distinction the highest according to Catholic theology and canon law. The fullness of the priesthood, as we used to say, is resident in the bishop. Everything above a bishop, like an archbishop or whatever, is a canonical heightened responsibility as a metropolitan or whatever. But there's no change. The highest you can be is a bishop, the Bishop of Rome. Okay, so everything else is at cardinals are special advisors to the Pope. They are the electors of a Pope, but they need not be priests. And we have instances in history. Cardinal Richelieu of France was a cardinal. Cardinal Mazarin, his successor, was not. There was a cardinal, I think, Antonelli in Italy in the mid-19th century, Secretary of State, I think, I may be wrong, but Secretary of State to Pius IX, who was a layman, or at the lower end of the tonsured state. He may have been tonsured, but he wasn't in major orders. That's why I understand. Could be wrong about that, but I think I'm right. So creating a woman a cardinal would have been an extraordinary moment of crossing a threshold. You would have said, not only am I empowering women by giving them positions of high governance, I'm creating a woman as a cardinal who will vote for my successor. Now you imagine what that would mean, okay? But he missed that. He missed that. I thought that was a call to special boldness, and which I thought he was capable, and he didn't do it. Now he may have his reasons for that, but it does seem to me the point that Chuck is making is a good one. For a good percentage of the world, the church appears to be antique, reserved, antiquated even, on the issue of women and their feminine genius, but also their exclusion from diaconal and presbyteral ministry. So given that, and given the fact that this question will not go away, and given the fact that Francis is making all kinds of important appointments, he's changing the chemistry. You know, once you have women in positions who appoint bishops, you know, we've already crossed a threshold line. And if you have a woman who's a cardinal, elect her, you already have women in the inner sanctum. How long can you make the argument for exclusion then? It becomes weaker and weaker. I'll end by saying this. I followed the issue of the debates over the ordination of women for several decades. I've written about it in other books. I understand the arguments. The theological arguments are not compelling. The ontological arguments are not persuasive. The biblical argument doesn't exist. I asked David Stanley once of the International Biblical Commission, who was involved in responding to Pope Paul VI Inter Insignories, which was the 1976 document. He said, we told the Pope, these are the principal biblical scholars in the Catholic Church, we told the Pope, you may decide that you don't want to ordain women priests. That's fine, but you can't do it on biblical grounds. There are no biblical grounds for their exclusion. Paul VI didn't want to hear this. So the issue doesn't go away. John Paul II attempted on several occasions to end the discussion. Like, we can't even talk about it. Well, that doesn't work, right? And so with Francis, the issue is back. And it's not, if not on the front burner, it's on one of the burners. And you can see it at the Synod. So the issue will continue to have to be addressed. And if they're going to be compelling arguments for the continued non-inclusion of women in ordained sacramental ministry in the Roman communion, if there are, you have to find arguments that persuade people. And so far, in my view, they haven't.
Looks like Mary Kate wants to get in.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for your feminist advocacy on behalf of women in the church. I am reminded, Michael, what you're saying. So in your very Canadian book, I learned a new term about hockey. You title the last chapter "Ragging the Puck," and I'm going to ask you to explain what that is, because I sort of grasped it, but I'm not a hockey aficionado. But I'm wondering if Francis, on this issue, if that's exactly kind of an example of him sort of, yeah. Okay, can you explain what the analogy is for those that didn't read your book yet?
There's an irony in this, because I'm not a sportsman myself.
But ragging the puck is that the player determines not to score the goal. So he delays, and it could be for any number of reasons, either to showcase another player or just simply to withhold the score. You don't score, so you rag the puck. That's what Francis is doing. He's not scoring, so he's ragging the puck.
It's called four corners defense in basketball. Maybe that.
You're better at this.
Just want to cut
So he's keeping
the Canadian stuff here.
I know. Well, here's the interesting thing: the ragging the puck is it's not a term that I think about at all. And a friend of mine who was a provincial economist working with the NDP government in Ontario, who was an historian and a very accomplished one and a very wealthy person, very wealthy, who had invested in Silicon Valley and made reams of money. But he's also driven by a very deep Catholic philanthropic and but he's also interested in theology. So he reads Edith Stein and he argues about the enduring genius of Simone Weil and all that. Anyway, the Pope appointed him to a committee, a subcommittee, to work on a universal human wage, but also to write a document on machine intelligence. As you may know, the Pope is spending au courant around AI. And he had the Vatican is so far into AI that it's embarrassing to many secular governments. The church has taken a very strong position on this for fear around transhuman and post-human and everything else, but also not condemning AI, trying to incorporate and understand its power. Anyway, so this guy, his name is Peter Warren, he appears in the book. Warren goes to Rome, and he meets with various Jesuits, and he meets with the Pope and others to discuss machine intelligence, but also a new economic order that allows for universal wage. Wouldn't that be great? We have that, right? So anyway, that's what he's doing. So while he's there, the Pope is giving some kind of presentation and whatnot, and he's looking a little wobbly. And so he says, oh my God, the Pope's going to resign. He said he'll resign, and Benedict was still alive at this point. He said, we're going to have two popes, now we're going to have a union. So how are we going to deal with this, right? So he says to me, when he got back, he said, I think Francis is ragging the puck. And I said, what do you mean? I said, he doesn't want to score it. He's just going to make sure that he's successful. It's not good. And I don't know if you agree with me on that, but I think there is something in Francis' makeup that hasn't gone so far and then stopped. I don't know whether it's state of caution. I don't know whether it's Jesuit discernment. I don't know what it is, but he's decided I'm going this far, but I'm not taking the next step. Okay? Now, you got again to put it in the context of papal history. He's made more steps than the others have. But has he followed through on various things? No, I have continuing anxiety over the clerical sex abuse thing. I don't think he's handled that as well as he could have. I think the whole issue of the episcopal appointments needs to be carefully scrutinized. I have issues with this, but at the same time, I recognize the particular Bergoglio genius, how he's moved the church into a culture of free expression without fear of censure, without fear of being excommunicated or denied or neglected or invalidated. When he makes the case of a church of inclusion and its working image is a field hospital, not the mystical body of Christ, not the social cost of perfecting, but a field hospital where the vulnerable and the broken and the bleeding gather. And when he says, I want to invert the pyramid, which was language, an image that occurred several times in the Synod, you have the image Pope at the top. He says it's got to be reversed. The Pope should be at the bottom. He's the servant of the servants of God. So you change the way you think of the church and the way it operates. These are revolutionary changes. Okay, it's going to be a long time for many Catholics to accept these ideas as the new ecclesial reality. So, on some issues, he brags the puck, on other issues, he scores.
Dave? I just want to agree with your dynamic, I think, that you describe about Francis and wanting to balance unity and innovation. You know, the disruption is not destruction. But again, justice delayed is also justice denied. How long must we wait, oh Lord? You know, if you're a woman, you know, that means nothing. They're just empty words. It's a tension. It's an almost irresolvable thing. I think it gets to 2 points, real quick points I'd make. One is it points to the limits of the papacy. That this mandate, divine mandate for unity, not uniformity, but for unity, is really curtails so much of what they can do. And again, I think that's where diversity comes in at the local level. I suspect we'll have women deacons, you know, national, like we had altar girls and things like that. It'll sort of be a local option thing. Will there be any women left in the church who want to be ordained? That's the whole problem. The other thing I just want to raise, your point though, I think your question is revealing about so much of what is going on today, especially with the Pope and the hospital, is the anxiety and the importance of the Pope. The whole premise of your question reveals how centrally important the Pope is and who the next Pope is. Whether you're conservative, whether you're moderate, whether you're liberal, it all feeds into a problematic, almost messianism. We're all banking on the next Pope being somebody who will do what we want. That's not, I think, great. I'm not talking about undoing the whole thing whatsoever, but also realizing that for the first 1800 years, nobody even knew the name of the Pope, the guy in white in Rome, who was always Italian for the most part. But the centrality of the Pope to any change is a problem. He is trying to change that, the whole synodality thing, which we could talk about forever. That is trying to change that dynamic. The discussion is trying to change that dynamic, but it's still so nail-bitingly, white-knuckling dependent on what those 138 guys do when they walk into the Sistine Chapel the next time. That doesn't seem healthy to me.
Well, thank you, Dave. And
Sorry for the downer.
No, our time is at an end, and that's probably a more sobering and more appropriate ending than the question I was going to ask about whether certain reforms in the church would happen before or after the Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup, which has also been a long time coming, as I understand. Thank you, everyone. And as I mentioned, there are copies of the book available for sale, and they will be available for sale and possibly even signing. And for those familiar with the cult of the saints, those might be future relics of Dr. Higgins. So again, thank you very much for your time and attendance this evening.
Let's see if we can.